We are in something of a golden age for Fire Emblem ROM hacks. It feels like every couple of weeks there is a new big project either announced or completed that I really want to try. The most recent game that I've reviewed for this channel was TMGC, which is not only my favorite Fire Emblem ROM hack, but one of my favorite video games of all time. And because I gave the game such high praise, I've been holding off on doing reviews of other hacks. I feel like it would be unfair to present something immediately after TMGC because it invites comparison, and I praise TMGC so much that anything is going to look bad in comparison. So I decided, if whatever game I pick is going to look bad no matter what, why don't I pick a bad game? And when I say a bad game, I don't necessarily mean an unenjoyable experience. Films like The Room or Goblins 2 are pretty thoroughly terrible, but if you get the right group of friends, they can be a blast to watch. My wife and I went to see Venom 3 in the theaters, and that is not high cinema, but it was incredibly fun. And in the spirit of bad movies, there are also bad video games that get cult followings for one reason or another. Sonic 2006 and Donkey Kong 64 are games that most people would agree are low quality, but they also have huge fan bases, and I consider myself to be a fan of both of them. My overall point is that in addition to using my platform to highlight good ROM hacks I think you should check out, I'm also going to use it to highlight bad ROM hacks I think you should check out. Whether that means playing them or watching some other unfortunate soul subject themselves to the torture, that is up to you. I am merely the slop dealer, and for our first helping of trash, I present Fire Emblem Sword of Heaven and Earth. I'll start by talking about Sword of Heaven and Earth's arguably biggest strength, that being its story. This is a tale set on the continent of Elite, and positions itself as a sequel to Fire Emblem 7, with events of the game taking place parallel to Fire Emblem 6. While we do know what happened to Hector and Eliwood during the Binding Blade, because Lyn was an OC for the Blazing Sword, we do not actually have a canonical fate for her. This game takes advantage of that by weaving a fanfiction story of what Lyn was up to during Zephiel's invasion. It also answers the question of what was going on with the Black Fang during the Binding Blade, and the answer to both is the Black Fang was kidnapping and brainwashing Lyn, which is actually kind of hilarious because of course if it's a Fire Emblem game you're going to work brainwashing into the plot somehow. The story itself isn't any sort of masterpiece, in fact I would go as far as to say it's a bad story, but it does frequently get you to point at the screen and say, hey, I know that guy. And that's pretty cool. I have a reputation as FE7's biggest hater, but even I got a smile on my face when Dorcas showed up as a promoted warrior in order to parallel Bartray from the Binding Blade. And there's even a solid argument that he is the best unit in the game, so if you are mutton-pilled, this is the ROM hack for you. But for everybody else who needs some more convincing, the story is often unintentionally hilarious due to the way that Google Translate fails to understand sentence structure when moving from Chinese to English. Because yes, this game was originally made by a Chinese ROM hacker, and the English version that we ended up with was entirely machine translated. If you've ever consumed works like Mario Story Thousands of Doors or Star Wars Backstroke of the West, then you know just how funny machine translation can be. Sometimes it just results in dialogue feeling rather stilted, but other times you get things like the friendly uncle thief. Or my personal favorite unit description, former husband who has stepped onto the path of magic, more mature than he used to be. This is the main reason that I compare Sword of Heaven and Earth to bad movies like The Room. The enjoyment that I get from this game is definitely not something the developer intended, but I still think it is a legitimately fun experience despite that. But of course, video games contain more than just their stories, and at least for me, I find the gameplay to be much more important than the story. The gameplay of Sword of Heaven and Earth is definitely weaker than the humor from the machine translation. The map design isn't exactly something I would describe as bad, but it doesn't stand up in the way that maps from more recent ROM hacks do. And honestly, to a degree, that is to be expected. This was one of the first ROM hacks ever put out there. It was released around the same time as things like Road to Ruin and The Last Promise. And with that context in mind, the maps really aren't that bad. I mean, people hail The Last Promise and give it leeway for being good for its time, but have you seen some of the maps in The Last Promise? They are misery to play through, even worse than FE7. In contrast, Sword of Heaven and Earth's maps are mostly just unmemorable. There's definitely some that have annoying parts to them, but I wouldn't say that they are frustrating or subtract from the enjoyment of Fire Emblem fundamentals. If you like the majority of maps from FEs 7 through 9, then you'll probably like most of what Sword of Heaven and Earth has to offer. And even if, like me, you don't really care for the map design from that era, Sword generally doesn't offer anything worse than the vanilla games would serve up. I know that's not exactly a ringing endorsement, and that's because I wouldn't ringingly endorse the gameplay of this, but I do think the gameplay is at least tolerable enough if you are interested in the machine-translated story, or you just have a lot of affection for the cast of FE7 and want to see what happens during this fan-fiction story about them. Before we finish, I do want to talk about two of the more interesting aspects of Sword of Heaven and Earth's gameplay. The first is that the majority of the cast are growth units, and based on the way that enemies scale, you are expected to grind up your growth units pretty significantly. This design definitely turns me off quite a bit. I am well known as not being a fan of grinding, but I know other people are often more tolerant of the grinding in Fire Emblem, and so your mileage may vary on how much it frustrates or doesn't frustrate you. You do occasionally get pre-promotes or units who can coast on their bases, but for the most part it's going to be growth units. That being said, on the topic of people who coast on their bases, one of the more interesting design decisions is around this game's Sagan. Sagan is a nomad, meaning that he can attack from either 1 range or 2 range, but he does not get access to 1-2 range. Because this game is modeled after FE7's design philosophies, having access to javelins or hand axes is a huge advantage. And the fact that he can't use either does make Sagan a lot less dominating during the early game, even though he has a statistical advantage over the rest of your crew. It does make the nomads and archers you get feel worse, because bows are kind of a niche weapon type in Sword of Heaven and Earth. So when your first pre-promote is a nomad and your second pre-promote is a warrior, it makes the rest of the bow units kind of feel stinky. That's really all I have to say about Sword of Heaven and Earth. If it sounds like the sort of thing that interests you, I would definitely check it out. There's less polish than you would expect nowadays, and that definitely got in the way of me finishing it, but when compared to other works from the time, I think this holds up better than most because of that bad movie DNA. In fact, let's compare Sword of Heaven and Earth to one of its contemporaries. The most popular hack of the time was The Last Promise, and I have a lot to say about that game, but it should probably get its own video. Instead, I'll focus on the only other FE7 hack that I've played, Fire Emblem Road to Ruin. That's right, baby, this is a surprise 2-for-1 feature. Double review, you got a double review, y'all. Well, I say double review, but it's really more of a 1.5 times review because a lot of my points from Sword of Heaven and Earth transfer over to Road to Ruin. The majority of your characters are growth units with an emphasis on routing maps in order to train them up. Most of the maps are pretty fun, but none of them stand out clearly in my memory. They're kind of just the spitting image of 7 out of 10 good enough. Road to Ruin does have a couple of cool ideas it's playing around with. The first one you can spot immediately upon booting up the game, and that is this game's Jagan, Ava, who is a sword master. Because sword masters have a crit bonus, this kind of clashes with her role for setting up kills. So she has a personal weapon, the training sword, which cannot critically hit and is only 3 might, allowing her to both delete enemies if you want her to, or more reliably set up kills with the training sword. I think this is a very cool idea, and honestly, I think more games should have a Jagan with a weapon that can't crit. Vander stealing your experience is one of the moments of all time. Another neat idea Road to Ruin implements is its support system. Each character only has a single support partner. I believe the reason for this is that support conversations are fully written, and having each person only have one support conversation greatly reduces the workload needed to write all the supports. But still, it is interesting, and it makes a sort of paired dynamic between the members of the cast. So if you're using one half of a pair, you are highly encouraged to use the other one, if for no other reason than to get the support benefits. But the most interesting new feature implemented into Road to Ruin is its interlude chapters. There are 2 maps where you take a break from the main cast in order to play as a group of side characters who do not gain any experience or have any rewards that transfer into the main cast. It's sort of like a more extreme version of Chapter 5X from the Sacred Stones. There are fail conditions if specific characters die in those maps, but you also get a boatload of generics who you can and probably should allow to die to make the map clear easier. I think these maps make for an interesting pace changer, and I honestly wish we got more of them in the main campaign, but at the same time I can see how they would be wearing on repeat playthroughs. I personally did not play this game multiple times. In fact, I didn't finish the game. I dropped it just out of lack of interest about halfway through. But just judging from how far I got, it definitely seems like the most competent of the 3 FE7 hacks I've played. That being Road to Ruin, Sword of Heaven and Earth, and The Last Promise. But that's the thing about Road to Ruin. It's competent, but I don't necessarily think I would highly recommend it. You'll have fun with the Fire Emblem fundamentals, and the story was, I'll be honest, not super interesting, but not offensively bad either. But it doesn't have any huge selling point to make it stick out from the more modern and polished hacks. Ironically, the laughable story from Sword of Heaven and Earth and the terrible map design from The Last Promise make for easier recommendations because it can sometimes be entertaining to marvel at these aspects of the games. TLP also has the added benefit of some really impressive eventing, especially with the post-game stuff, and Sword of Heaven and Earth can be appealing to anyone who loves the cast of FE7. Road to Ruin doesn't have much going for it other than the fact that it's good enough, and good enough doesn't really sound like the sort of quote you would put on the back of a box. Don't get me wrong, if you play Road to Ruin, you will almost certainly have a good time. But if it stays in your backlog until the day you die, well, it's not like you're missing a ton anyway. The game came out 10 years ago, and I'm honestly kind of surprised that it wasn't more popular back then. Like, it's easy for me to pass on now because there are so many other good ROM hacks that are more polished and well made, but back in 2011, there were not that many completed ROM hacks. Road to Ruin doesn't just have a complete campaign, but a competent one with varied objectives. It's kind of a shame, because I do think that this hack should have been more popular in the past, and I would love to recommend it more highly to correct that error, but at the same time, it's hard to give anything more than a half-hearted endorsement to a hack that I didn't finish because I got bored. If you're looking to engage with something that isn't going to challenge you with large amounts of skills and complicated weapons, this is a decent hack to play. But if you'd rather engage with something more complex or unique, then I would say look elsewhere. I think that's as good a place as any to wrap up the video. Today's comment code word is chest key, so if you made it to the end of the video, make sure you include chest key in your comment so I know that you made it. And because I'm recording this a couple of weeks in advance, I'm going to cut to future Danny so she can more accurately read the full list of my patrons and thank them. Thanks, past Danny. Alright, thank you to Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smazruby, Mara McLean, Calamity Callie, Adele, Thaythom, Andu Reflect, YL01, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, George Grenville the 7th PM, Gabe the Green, Control-Alt-Aegis, Joanna the Wrench Witch, Roman Cormancic, Knick Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Bell Wenska, Dysyke, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Aerith Emblem, and especially my Jagans, Lilzabeth, Floahay, Autumn Kelsey, and Julia Kyoto. I have the extremely convenient problem of having too many names to read out, so if I missed yours, please let me know it wasn't on purpose. If you would love to join these lovely people on screen, there is a link to my Patreon below, but please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. Free ways to support the channel include liking, subscribing, commenting for the algorithm, all that fun stuff. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe, gamers.